Welcome to the 16th episode of the Sydney Contrarian, and this is the second in the series of a truly first world problem, misinformed about the government. So in this episode, I'd like to talk a bit more about politics and also the government that we have in the Western world, but I'll focus a bit more locally in Australia. Now, Australia, like most Western nations, face a crisis, and it's actually due to many different aspects. It's an issue over the identity of our nation, our heritage, our economy, of course, in the sense that we are facing a growing debt crisis in the government and also on household debt and corporate debt. And this is also in the face of rising interest rates. We also have an issue with social justice, what they call in terms of equality of people and the types of rights that people should be allowed, regardless of what their thoughts are, what their sexual orientation are, their ethnic background, and many more. We're also dealing with problems with demographics of the aging population, that there are now less people who are being born, at least within certain racial groups, especially the ones who have been living in Australia for a long time, whether they're the Caucasians or Asians. But then we are facing rising immigration from third world countries, and their fertility rate is much higher. We also face an issue with education in terms of the fact that we are seeing that the education system, the quality is coming down, but there is increased funding being pushed towards education, and yet the results that are being delivered are highly questionable. We have issues regarding our health system, that there's now more people who need the health, who are needing healthcare services funded by the government, but where's the money that coming from in the government? Now, these types of problems have been seen to be possibly solved through governments, or at least that's what we've been used to, either through the way government officials have sold themselves to be our representatives to save us from problems, whereas the media also spending a lot of time talking about governmental social problems and then saying how the government could address it. And of course in the education system, where people, especially in the public education system, are virtually, I would say, indoctrinated, that may be an extreme word, into thinking that most problems could be solved through the government. And at least in my days when I was a primary school student, we were encouraged to learn to write to our local representatives in Parliament to talk to get them to address social issues. Whether people actually ended up doing that or not, at least we had those writing exercises, which was actually basically telling us, see, if there's a problem, get the government to help out. Now, when it comes to the issue of politics, what I find very interesting is everyone seems to have an opinion about politics, sometimes so strong that because people's friendships could be strained, then they go, well, let's not talk about politics and let's avoid this issue because that way it's going to keep the peace, which actually shows how pervasive politics is in people's lives and in people's mind. But if you actually look carefully and hear certain people talk about it, and sometimes even myself, you'll see how underinformed or misinformed about the way our governments and politics in general, how the political system works. I'm not here to talk about and educate people about how government works or how political parties what they stand for. What I want to talk about in this episode is in particular just this notion that do we actually know what we're voting for? Do we actually know how these parties have actually have actually changed to a point where some of them no longer represent the values that we think they are. And there needs to be ways for us to go and address it in terms of how do we better equip ourselves so when we're talking about politics and we're making decisions during the elections, we are going to be well informed about it. And in the end, society is going to be made better through better education of the people, so that actually keeps the politicians honest, because the politicians are a representative of society, and at the same time, it does reflect to what extent our society is educated enough to select the right people to represent us and make decisions on our behalf. Now, if you look at the recent political scene in Australia, it is actually dire straits. We've got poor quality politicians who are exposed nowadays for corruption, criminal behavior, and in particular committing fraud in order to win the elections. So we've got, for example, the Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews, who is now facing problems within his own Labour Party about how they were rorting funds in order to win the 2014 state election. And furthermore, of course, it should also be said that this Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews have been actually, since elected, using significant government funding to support things like safe schools, and also to support certain minority groups in order to help these people and potentially retain votes that may help him be re-elected in the next election. Although it seems like now these scandals that are plaguing him and his current government, that may actually lead to his downfall in the next election. We also have, for example, people like Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce, who has actually now become a backbencher. He stood down from the Deputy Prime Ministership after it was surfaced that he had an affair with a staffer who actually, through this affair, was employed in his own office. So that was actually misuse of power, and in a way, this is commonly seen even in corporate culture and also in various parts of the public. But certainly, when it comes to government, this is quite severe. It reflects how bad our society is. That it's only through exposure that we see how deep some of the rot has become. We've also seen the citizenship saga affecting virtually all parties in our current parliament. And funnily enough, and again I'm going to bash the Australian Labor Party, is that the opposition leader Bill Shorten said that there's no saga like this saga on the citizenship, dual citizenship, which is not reported by their parliamentarians, that is not affecting their party, and yet now it's actually surfacing that we have quite a few of those members in the party, and worse still, they are actually trying to fight tooth and nail to prevent themselves from being referred to the High Court and possibly having to stand down, simply because we have politicians who are racked with pride, and they go and say that they make high claims which they cannot back, and when they're caught out, they double down and try to protect their own backside, which actually is worse than if they go, well, you know what, I shouldn't have made that statement, and I'm going to take the consequence of making such a bold statement in the first place. Nowadays, the stakes are too high, and yet also what is expected of these people are very, very low. Now, how did we get to this stage where we have people of such, you could say, almost ill repute or low morals, low moral standing and ethics? How did we get these people into Parliament? The issue is that we have in most Western nations democracy, and even though there are constitutions and a set of laws that back this by which the democracy works, it becomes weakened when you have a fluid set of rules which are changed or possibly can be changed by a mere majority of votes. In Australia, we do have a constitutional monarchy. At least it is. We swear allegiance to the Queen. There is a constitution in the monarchy, and yet we can actually vote our leaders who represent us. But the constitution is actually quite weak, and I think most people do not understand the extent to which the constitution protects the rights of Australian citizens, or otherwise. In fact, I personally need to be educated a bit more about it. And the issue is quite often our government, and also even the public, whether it's corporations or individuals, not knowing this constitution, and the constitution being rather weakly applied, it actually leads to this type of problem that we have. That if you actually manage to mislead the general public over time, you are going to be able to lead. You're going to be able to have representatives leading the government and also the country of declining moral values, declining capability, and declining general quality of the nation because of the way democracy is structured. How do they do that? For example, you could actually have slick media campaigns. Most people, the best way they get informed in politics is to switch on TV or read the newspapers, and that's actually what structures their understanding of what is going on in the government, what types of policies are good, what types of things they should stand for in the country to be a good Australian citizen. And then they get railroaded into understanding that this is the way to go, and they vote accordingly. There is little, I'd say, balanced view on our mainstream media, as you will notice with Channel 7, 9, and 10, ABC, SBS. Most of them are leaning towards bigger governments and basically the left. Newspapers are quite similar, although you do see some dissenting voices in newspapers like the Australian and the Daily Telegraph, where they do sometimes criticize the issues that are happening, and you have actually journalists within the same newspaper company actually criticizing each other, or at least criticizing the values that are being held on when they're writing articles. So the media actually causes people to lean more towards the left. What I mean by the left is that they believe that you can continually make progress to society at the past, maybe over time can be replaced, because as times change, so should people and social values. And the way they do so is that they believe they do it through the government, through authority, because it's easier to coerce people to make changes and then say, well, the majority voted for it, than to actually try and take the slower step of proving why it is that the change is necessary, and also giving it a go, starting small and then expanding it to society in general. Now, our public education also injects this type of leftism into our society, and they do so starting with children. And I find it very interesting, because when I was a primary school student, I used to think that global warming was an issue, and that the United Nations, Greenpeace, and a lot of these scientists who support things like global warming and now what they call climate change are indeed good people and of very good moral standing. So we would have lessons where we talk about these issues, and from our teachers would guide us into thinking, well, imagine that you were in a summit in the United Nations and we're discussing this issue about the Great Barrier Reef being affected, like the Great Barrier Reef being affected detrimentally, is shrinking, and their corals dying. The coral reefs are dying because there's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere caused by things like coal power plants and pollutants and high carbon dioxide, like carbon footprints of companies. What would you do if you were an official there? And we'll all have debates and discussions. And it seemed like the good people were the ones who supported reducing carbon emission and also using clean energy and recycling. But we actually ignore the other side of the story, which includes what are the costs involved in doing such things. We also ignore the fact that to support clean energy, you do need oil prices and gas prices to be higher, which would make the economy more. The cost of production is going to increase because virtually everything requires energy, and if energy cost goes up, then everything goes up. It ignores the fact that certain countries can't afford this, but at the same time, we all, as a global village, has to actually follow suit. So we ignore the fact that on one end, we're saying these African countries and third world countries, not just in Africa, but in South America, in Asia, they're starving, and on one hand, we're taught to have compassion for them, and that we should support some charity organizations, but we ignore the fact that we actually cause some of these problems. So we are only taught the good side of certain policies, but we actually not taught the other side, which may be much more inconvenient, and the costs and the negative impact of such policies, if it's actually laid out, will outweigh the benefits and the positive impact such policies could be implemented. And the arguments that I don't think we've ever seen people challenge teachers in saying, well, why don't you consider this? But I could imagine that the teachers who are in this education system would sit and actually say, well, we actually never saw this, or we weren't told these types of things, and if we tell the students, that would be too much for them to understand, so we just want to teach them that one side of the story. So that's basically indoctrination. You're actually giving them a bunch of biased facts. They are facts, I don't deny it, without actually giving them a balanced view, so then they're going to make one-sided decisions. So over generations, not only on climate change, but we've got these types of indoctrination going through in public schools on what is science, which is basically, they say it's evolution, it's biology based on the theory of evolution, and that religious values and faith-based science is not science. So then students are going to grow up to reject it. You also have schools teaching students about economics, in that economics seems to be linked to or almost directly driven by social and governmental policies. So the automatic solution that people are going to have when they are of voting age is, if there's an economic problem, get the government to solve it. I might be simplifying some of this. I might be making a bit of an exaggeration, but you get the idea. And I challenge you, go out and ask people around you about the general economy and how to solve it. I can guarantee you, the super majority, at least 2/3, 3/4 of the people that you talk to, when they are asked how do you solve an economic problem, they're going to say, why not get the government to put these policies in? Why not get the government to regulate the companies so that the companies don't gouge off us? They forget the fact that corporations, if you're talking about greedy corporations, getting a government to control them, you got to be kidding me. if you look at the funding that the governments are actually getting, especially in election campaigns, they come mainly from corporations. And that's why you have corporations getting stronger with certain governments being elected, simply because you just voted in people who were funded by these corporations. So you're not actually solving a problem, you're just a misinformed person who, in the process of thinking that they solved the problem, have actually compounded the problem. Now, the other thing which I thought is really interesting to bring up is that the government never creates anything. So when we're saying that we're going to get the government to help us solve problems with the economy or problems with resource allocation, that the government is going to come in and create wealth for us, that's rubbish. The government actually takes with two hands and gives with one. Now, why do I say that? Because the government only exists through the funding obtained by taxation of individuals and companies. They will also earn funding from donations, which also come from people. The government is not this thing that creates things, it's just moving things around. And it does so through the use of the law, backed by the military and the police. So if you're saying, well, the country is poor, let's vote in a government who will help us become less poor, that's idiotic. How do we actually get a nation that produces more? When you have people and corporations, which is a group of people, doing things, creating things, and then selling it for more than what it cost to produce it. The government's role in there, rather than the government helps us create, the government should do less, so then there's more room for people to actually go and create things. It's very simple. And I know that some of us would sit there and go, well, no. The government has to be there to allow business activity to happen. Well, not really. Because when you think about thousands of years ago, you had people who slowly created themselves into societies. And then as a society got bigger, then you needed people to manage for them. It wasn't the other way around, that people actually created a society and then had people to manage that, then they go about and created and farm their own crops, or they raise animals. No. People actually looked after themselves, and then as they got bigger, they wanted to be more efficient. Then they had the idea of, let's get these people to organize ourselves, and then we're going to get a bunch of people who are the leaders, who will help organize for us. And then the government is basically a structured way of doing so. So in knowing that, it's important then to identify, well, which parties do we have in our Australian government? And I believe that a prosperous nation is one where you actually get the government to solve less problems. Why? Because the government now, their aim is to keep themselves in government by having the majority. And to capture the majority, you have to promise them things. But it used to work, because when we had a more prosperous nation, there was more that we used to have. So we could promise to give things, and then after the government is elected, the government is able to then go and fulfill the promises. Nowadays, we got rising debt. If you looked at my previous episodes, Australia's debt, government debt, is over $350 billion, and it's going to rise even further. And who's going to pay for it? Us. So we voted for these people who will give us free goods and services and benefits, but we actually have to pay for it. And if we can't pay for it, if the government thinks we can't pay for it and we can't afford it, what they have to do is either raise taxes or cut the benefits. So that's why there's more disappointment in our society in recent times. So the solution to that is rely less on the government. Be financially independent. The reason why is the less you rely on the government, the less you go to the government for help, and the government will naturally then see itself to be less useful. There will be less and less of the government and more resources that can be now available for us to go and use, rather than have the government go and take the resources and then distribute it back to us. And the whole talk about, well, what about the poor? What about those people who are minority groups who are being oppressed and discriminated against, and the government goes and helps us? No. The only reason why these things happen is because you don't have enough resources. If there's enough resources to go around, people are not going to cry foul and cry discrimination, because there is actually opportunity for them to access it. It's only when you have less resources that certain people are going to notice that they have less than others, and then they're going to cry foul. Watch out also for the media. The media is actually strongly backed and funded by governments. Well, you have the ABC, which is actually backed by almost $1 billion of taxpayer funding. SBS is also backed by taxpayer funding. And then you go to channel 7, 9, and 10. These are corporations which are actually generally failing in the stock market. There's substantial ownership, as I said before, by financial corporations, who themselves are strongly backed by the government and also backing the government in order to keep their monopoly positions, or at least their own market share in the economy. The finance sector is actually one that is similar to government. It says it's there to help allocate resources and distribute it around and makes the economy move. But look at how much they actually earn in between, how big the cut is for this middleman. So you could actually logically deduce, if they fund the media corporations who inform us about government, and they have a larger market share in the economy than they're justified, who's actually keeping them in there? Who's keeping their market share, and who's justifying their presence? Of course, the government. Otherwise, if there's less government, we don't actually really need them. People are going to be able to still trade among themselves, and if you see that the finance sector is taking too much resources, we'll just either compete them away so that they have less market share, or we find ways to circumvent it. But if the government's there, it actually keeps them there, because the government goes, well, you need to go through that. Now, the other thing I also want to get people to understand also about government is, when you're voting for them and you're saying, well, I want a policy, I like this particular policy, so I'm voting for a particular government, have a think about to what extent you actually have been sold a policy by the media or by government officials for their motives, for their agenda. No policy is ever completely beneficial. It never could be possible that it sounds so great and that there is no negative backlash. This is especially the case I'm seeing with recent campaigns, especially on things like social justice issues and on healthcare. Healthcare is always sold in terms of all these people could not afford seeing a doctor or getting access to medical services. That's why if you elect me, I am going to fix this healthcare system. I'm going to make it more accessible. Well, excuse me, why are medical services and costs rising? Simply because more people are using it relative to what is supplied, or secondly, the government is able to keep the prices up and going up higher for the sake of more people are using it, it's beneficial, it justifies the cost going up. You guys can afford it, you guys should pay for it. If you actually don't have the government involvement, if it's such a good service, we can provide it for ourselves. And have you noticed that, especially in technology, did rise in technology lead to us paying more for technology, for our computers, for our mobile phones? No. As technology got better in the mobile phone and communications aspect, we paid less. So can you see the whole thing about government-funded healthcare and then you see the rising cost of government-funded healthcare, you should actually say the government is the cause of the problem because it's regulated, and every single time we deliver more services, there is actually more ways to reward that service, which causes costs to go up, and there is less efficiency. So what is the solution to it? We should actually not sit there and think, well, the politicians and the media say, would you want to deprive old people and poor people of better quality health? You should actually say, yours definitely not the solution. That's just one of many examples. I could talk to you about other examples of it, but you get the idea. And finally, one thing I also want to say about what government officials and the media says regarding policies are, a policy is only as good as how they sell it. And if they have to sell it harder to you, it's not a good policy. And the line that you definitely must draw and know that is a crappy policy is if they start using public figures and celebrities who have nothing to do with that policy and they become the spokespeople. Advertising is basically an art form of selling to you something that you don't need, and this is exactly what they're doing. When they use public figures and celebrities, they're advertising. So it means that the product was not good in the first place. This policy is not good. If I tell it to you straight, I have to find another way to lure you in. And nowadays, we are suckers for it. What annoys me to no end, and what should annoy you as a listener to no end, is when you also have celebrities who have been standing up for a particular cause for long enough that they are now deemed experts in that area, compared to the true experts who actually do the background studies, who have the data, who have the evidence, who have the theory, who have tried and looked at these things. They're not experts compared to celebrities just because they've been on the stage behind a microphone and they're just parroting the things that a particular organization wanting that policy to be delivered. It's ridiculous. Okay, I've actually talked quite a long time for this episode. This one is actually one of the longest I've delivered. I hope you've stuck with me for these 40 minutes or so, and I hope you're better informed. So hopefully I'll deliver another episode on this series, and I think what I'm going to talk about in the next one is about the education system. And until then, thanks for listening to me. And this is from the Sydney Contrarian. Thank you very much, and God bless.